This is Gene DeLisio with a featured sports interview from WDLB and WOSQ. Dr. Russell Lewis was a well-known obstetrician in Marshfield for many years, but also a graduate of McKinley High School in Marshfield. Dr. Lewis played on McKinley's Wisconsin Valley Conference football championship team of 1932. He lived well past the age of 90 and was a great resource for those studying the history of sports in Marshfield. Dr. Lewis first came to Marshfield in the spring of 1928 when his father became the superintendent of schools. Prior to that, Lewis lived and went to school in the Reedsburg area.
It was a wonderful experience. I started kindergarten in Reedsburg and went through 6th grade, and I learned how to swim because they were a far advanced community in those days. They had a swimming pool. The Baraboo River was too filthy to swim in those days before it cleaned it up. And they had a nice golf course. I learned how to play golf in Reedsburg. My father taught me that. I enjoyed school. I had a wonderful time there. It was a great city, and I had a lot of good friends. They're all dead now, unfortunately.
Any memories of what the town was like itself?
Oh, sure. I remember it very well because it was sort of divided by the Baraboo River. There was the west side, and then there was the east side. Most of it was on the east side, but it was a nice place. I can remember Phillips lumberyard right across the river, and we always lived on we lived on Willow Drive most of the time. A couple of years right on the big where the park is, right down in the middle of town, just a block off of town. And I can remember as a kid the pecannery was open in those days, and in the season when they came in with the horses they brought the peas in with the horses and sleighs, and we'd sit out there behind the bushes and run out and swipe peas from the load, and the farmers never objected to that. We had a wonderful time, yeah.
What was the athletics like at Reedsburg and the school systems back then?
They had a very nice gymnasium for that time, and a good basketball team. They had some good football teams. Baraboo beat them more often than they should have, but it was very nice. The gym was so nice, they usually had the state basketball sectionals held there, and so we got to see some of these small towns that would come in and play there. And they had a good track team. I can remember once near the high school, one of the fellows got hit through the shoulder with a javelin. Somebody was practicing. One of the fellows, Paul Krieger, I think, ran the mile and won at the state championship. They had a nice athletic program.
Well, you left Reedsburg, I guess, at about the summer of 1928 and came to Marshfield. And tell us the circumstances which brought you here to Marshfield.
Well, my father was superintendent of schools in Reedsburg, and when a man named Newland left Marshfield in 28, the school board chose my father to come here, and this was a bigger school system, and I'm sure there was a little bit more pay, and so he came here, yeah.
What were your early impressions of the city of Marshfield?
Well, I liked the Marshfield community because we moved in on West 6th Street, right across the street from McKinley High School, and there were a lot of fine young guys up there, and I've had no trouble finding friends, and we used to go out. In front of McKinley was the big football field with a cinder track around it, and played a lot of softball there too. But we'd go out in the summer, that's when I got to know people, threw the football around and kicked the football and had pick-up games and that sort of thing. So it was very much fun, yeah.
Well, when you came here, of course, the high school was McKinley High School.
Right.
And can you, for those of us who of course, never saw McKinley, what it was like, tell us what that building was like, what it was like to attend classes in McKinley High School?
Well, the most memorable part of it was just an old building with a huge wooden stairway going in. You go in the front door and go up the second floor. It was a huge, big, I'm sure it burned down very easily. There was a little small locker room, so we'd always practice football right outside in the front yard, so to speak, and just a small place you could change your clothes there. They had nice classrooms on the second floor where most of the classes were held. It was a nice school. It had one of these outside fire escapes. You know, if you big fire came along, you were supposed to slide down the chute on the west side of the thing, and we had wonderful teachers, so it was a good school. Yeah.
You mentioned that the football field, at least your practice field, was in front of the school. Tell us about, did you play games on that facility, or are there some other places you played the Tiger home games?
No, we never played any games on that facility. It was just strictly a practice field. It was basically 100 yards long, but it really wasn't quite 100 yards with a track around the outside of it, yeah. Mm-hmm. But when we were done, when I went to Purdy School, which is where I started school here, we had to go down to Washington School to practice because at Purdy School there was no grass or anything. In Washington School, which is where Washington Square is, where the new Pick and Save just opened, I think that was the original high school in town. Then it became a grade school, and that had a nice lawn, and we played practice down there. We had to dress at Purdy School and run down the block, 2 blocks down there to practice. Yeah.
So before Beal Stadium was built, where did your teams play their home games here in Marshfield?
That was sometimes a problem. Most of the time we played in the fairgrounds, right in the middle of the fairgrounds out there. But there was an old airport just south and west of that fairgrounds, east of Maple Avenue. It was called Berghammer's because Mr. Berghammer had the only airplane in town, I think, although somebody named Miner had one too. But Berghammer, that sometime, and my junior year, the year 32, that we had the championship team, the first game we had to play out of town because there wasn't a field available in Marshfield because the city was broke and they hadn't had a chance to fix it up. So we played at Wisconsin Rapids, I think. We played against Stevens Point. And by the third game, which was our next home game against Antigo, the fairgrounds had been made ready, so we played out there. There were no bleachers. People had to stand on the sidelines, yeah.
Well, that certainly was a different era. You came here, as you mentioned, in the spring and summer of 1928, just after Marshfield had won the conference championship with that great team in the fall of 1927. So you did not have a chance to see that team play, but I'm sure you heard a lot about them and then saw some of those players individually in the ensuing years. But tell us what you heard about that 1927 team.
Well, I heard it was the greatest team Marshfield ever had, and I think up until the last, since Mr. Litke's come to town, probably was the best team that Marshfield ever had because they had 4 backs that went on to play college ball. They had some big guys in the line, and apparently the coach was an excellent coach. And Wisconsin Rapids, which was a wealthier community in that time, hired him away as the coach in 1928, so that when I came to town, my father hired Jack Murphy as the coach. And my dad incidentally had coached Murphy when Murphy was in high school at Mount Horeb. But I heard nothing but wonderful things. I know they were fast people. I remember hearing about how they had relays at the Marshfield Fair in those days, and the 4 backs would run the relay and win every time. They were supposed to be a very good team, yeah.
Well, it certainly was. And there were some guys on that team that were holdovers that did play in 28 that probably you did see. Bill Millar was one. Vic Christie, I think, was one, and a few others. Any recollections you have of seeing some of those guys play the following year?
Not really. I can remember seeing Bill Millar play because Bill Millar was an interesting man. He's only stood about 5'8" or 9", but he weighed about 220. Or I think he eventually, when he went to Madison, he was weighing about 240, and he was very, very fast. He was broad. I don't know of anybody that was any broader than he was, and a very nice, delightful person. I got to know him, but he played very well for 1 year at Madison. Then he had to fight with Spears and didn't go out anymore. He played tackle down there. They used to say that Bill couldn't remember the signals, so he was better off in the line than he was in the backfield, but I don't know about that, yeah.
Well, you mentioned, Dr. Lewis, that it was your father who brought Jack Murphy here to become the coach for the 28 season. And again, tell us the circumstances of Jack coming into town and being hired as Marshfield's coach. What did your father see in this man that made him bring him to Marshfield, where he served the school system so well for so long?
Well, I think at first he knew Jack my father was the superintendent of schools in Mount Horeb for 4 years, from 1917 to 1921. He went there when he was only 24 years old as superintendent of schools. But he coached Jack in high school, knew Jack. Jack went to lacrosse. And when he graduated, he took the job as head coach at Baraboo. So during those years, my father was at Reedsburg. We played Baraboo. They were our main enemy in those days, probably still are. And as I mentioned before, Baraboo quite frequently won, so my dad was impressed with Jack. Jack had two people that played for him at Baraboo that went on and played basketball at the University of Minnesota and were stars up there. So he thought he was a good coach, and the coaching vacancy was here, and so he hired Jack, yeah.
And I know Jack Murphy was a very popular man over the years. So tell us what kind of a man he was.
Well, he was always a pleasant man. I never heard him swear. He never kicked a player. He was he was a gentleman in every respect. He was a short man. He got to be a little bit heavy. It was always sort of a standing joke because sometimes he'd have some of these guys that were playing halfback thought they were pretty good. And he could beat any one of them, even when he was 40 years old in a 40-yard dash. He was the fastest man around. He was just he was a delight. But I think the problems got to him, especially when he came and he had a couple championships in football in the first few years, and then fortunes really declined badly after that. And so he gave up coaching in the football in the late 30s, and they hired Ted Menzel from Stevens Point. He kept on with the basketball longer, and of course then he got to be involved in administration. And everybody liked Jack Murphy. He was just a friendly Irishman, yeah. He had a wonderful wife, too.
Oh, yeah, tell us about her.
Helen Kapleen was she was one of the most popular teachers here. She came from Portage, a redhead, very fiery redhead, and she decided she was going to marry Jack. I don't think Jack was a marrying kind, but eventually she won, and they got married and had a very happy life, I think, yeah.
One of the holdovers from the Carl Clandra days to the Jack Murphy days was Al Bitzer, the assistant coach who was in the Marshfield school system, I believe, in the early 1970s, served for many, many years. And everybody credits Al Bitzer with a lot of the success of that football program also. Tell us about him and what he added to the football program.
Well, Al Bitzer was one of my heroes, so I can't say enough nice things about him. He was a marvelous teacher, greatest manual art teachers that ever existed, I think. He was a tough guy. He was the tough guy with Murphy being the pleasant guy, and he played the tough guy. He didn't think anything about kicking you in the rear end if you weren't doing your job, and it didn't make any difference to him who you were. He treated everybody alike. He didn't swear much, but he was just a tough guy, and he played tough. He wanted everybody to play tough, and he'd get in there himself. He loved to do things. He never wore shoulder pads or got dressed, but he'd take people on and show them how to do this and all that sort of thing. And he was just a wonderful man in all respects, yeah.
And I've heard stories about how he would actually get down in the line and practice with the ball players if need be.
Oh, he would. He did that all the time. Yeah, he liked to do that, yeah. He'd played a little college ball, I think. He came from Medford originally, and he played at Milwaukee where he went to school. But he was a tough character who liked to play. He liked to get physical. When I came here, he was playing basketball for the Company C team that used to play over in the old Army before it was downtown back in those days. He was a good basketball player too, but much better in football, yeah. He was not a big man. He was probably 6 feet tall and weighed 180 or so, but just a well-built guy. He eventually ran the Hefco pool, and I worked as a lifeguard with him there, and I got to know him very well, yeah. Fine man.
Well, Dr. Lewis, as you mentioned, when you came to Marshfield, you were not quite of high school age, so you spent a year or two playing junior high football for the Purdy team. What was junior high football like back in those days?
Well, we had an unusual situation because we had a wonderful team. We won all our games easily. As an eighth grader, I broke my arm early in the season, so I didn't play. As a ninth grader, I played center on the team, and we had a lot of, remember these were the Depression years, and so we had a lot of kids that were 17 or 18 years old playing as freshmen. But we played a lot of small schools, but we also played some junior high schools or B teams from other schools. And Frank Rademacher was the coach. And we had people like Laverne Riedel, who's still living here in town at age 90. He was a wonderful halfback, but he turned 20 before he got through the junior year in high school, he could only play high school ball for 1 year, that sort of thing. Floyd Ellison, who was one of the star tackles on our 32 team, couldn't play as a senior because he was too old. So we had a kid named Tommy O'Reilly that came from Nasonville. It was a wonderful halfback, but Tommy didn't play much in high school. He didn't enjoy it very much. But at Purdy school level, and they were bigger than the average kids because they were older. So we did very well in junior high school. Yeah.
You mentioned your coach, Mr. Rademacher. What was he like?
Frank Rademacher was a very good athlete. He was a nice guy. Came from Stanley originally, but he went to River Falls and had been a star athlete there. He was a science teacher at Purdy School, and he coached. That was just a sideline with him. Yeah. The other coach was Augie Keller, who was a mathematics teacher at high school, junior high school, Purdy School. But Frank was the main coach.
You know, I've seen in the newspaper articles and from the News Herald back in that era, there was a lot of publicity on the junior high teams. Was junior high football, of course, not as big as McKinley High School, but was junior high football in Marshfield, the Purdy teams, pretty well publicized or pretty well followed by the local fans?
I think all the teams were followed by the local fans. They had a sports writer named Louis Schmall in this town for the News Herald. He had almost a daily column, something by Louis, and he'd spent a lot of time writing about the high school and more than I would expect about the junior high school. So that people who wanted to follow those sports, it's totally different now, as near as I can tell. They don't have the time, they don't have enough people or something, it's just changed. But in those days, well, even through Bob Stevenson was a wonderful sports writer, but back Louis Schmall spent the time, and I guess he didn't have much else to do maybe. We had a lot of publicity in the newspaper, so you read about it, heard about it a lot more than you might today, yeah.
Well, some of my research, I've read probably as many Louis Schmall columns as anybody else has. Did you ever meet that man and know anything about him?
Oh, sure, yeah. He was one of the last people you would expect to be interested in sports. He just didn't seem that type. He didn't look like he was interested, he didn't look like he ever did a thing in his spine, but he was a good writer, and he was interested, and he came out and talked to people, yeah. Very nice. Well, he wasn't much older than we were. Yeah. I don't know how old Louis was, but I'm sure he hadn't been out of high school, or I don't know he went to college. I think he was a local boy that just got into the business. He may have gone to college and become a journalist. I don't know, yeah.
Well, Dr. Lewis, you did not play on the 1930 team. I guess you were a freshman in 1930.
That's right.
And did not play on that team. But boy, that was a great team also that won or at least tied for a Wisconsin Valley Conference championship. But give us your thoughts about what you saw from that 1930 team.
Well, I think it was built around Carl Schulke, who was such a wonderful back, because he was not only big for a high school kid, he was fast, and they had a very smart quarterback. In those days, the quarterbacks called the signals. The coaches didn't come in, players didn't come in from the sidelines or anything like that. And of course, in those days, as you know, it was two-way football. The offensive team and the defensive team played all the time. It played both ways. And Leo Schoenhofen was a smart quarterback, and he had a good line. That Irv Scheibe was one of the tackles, and a fellow named Cook. The two of them were excellent people, and as I recall, Paulie Steinert and Ed Goldbach played ends, but I'm not sure about that. And I think that Emery Varney played one of the guards, and maybe Charlie Aldrich was the other guard. Walter Ganster, I think, was the center in those days. They were all fairly good sized. Eddie Goldbach at the end was a pretty big man, and they're much bigger than our team was in 1932. And they were good athletes. Steinert and some of those guys played basketball. Henning was a good basketball player, and Schulke was an excellent basketball player too. So they were a nice bunch of people. They did well. Nobody expected them to do well. It came on because the 29 team hadn't been much of anything at all. Just like in 32, the 31 team was, I think we one game at the most in 31. Then all of a sudden, 32, we turned everything around. Yeah.
Carl Schulke, by my records, ran for close to 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns in 8 games, so he was quite a runner. Anything you recall about his style or what made him such a strong runner?
I think it was his speed. I think he was faster than most anybody else. He was like his nephew Jerry Witt, who played later and was a state champion in 100-yard dash and 220. But Carl was, I don't know how heavy, but Carl must have been 190 pounds, and he was just solid. And so he ran hard and he ran fast, and he had a good line. I think the line was a very good line to give him some openings.
You know, one thing that's impressed me about at least the numbers on Carl Schilke is the number of attempts that he had in the game. I had him in one game, he had 44 rushing attempts, 36 in another, 32. He averaged almost 30 attempts per game, which is a lot of the high school level, and yet he was able to hold up under that kind of a pounding. Really shows what kind of a tough guy he must have been.
Well, I never was considered a tough guy. I don't think he ever was. No, obviously he was, but I people didn't think of him that way, and I don't know why. I suspect because he was the only. Henning was not a runner; he was more of a blocker, and both Dix and Egger, who played fullback, didn't weigh more than 125 or 140 pounds. Dix probably weighed 140, and they weren't at that time. They were both sophomores. They weren't ball carriers, so there wasn't anybody else to carry the ball really, and passing in those days was pretty rare. Shane often did the passing, but he wasn't very good, and they didn't do much of it any. So it was all Schilke. That was about all they had. Yeah.
Well, the stats I have here show that as the year went on, it looks like they gave the ball more and more to Ray Egger. So apparently he did develop somewhat as the season progressed. You mentioned he was only a sophomore, though, but it looks like he did a few pretty good things for them. Any recollections of his contributions to that team?
Well, the main one I can remember was because Dix was the starter, then he got hurt, and Egger was a better back than Dix anyway, but and he developed a lot. I don't recall Ray Egger even playing football in ninth grade. I'm sure he did, but I don't remember it at all. And the thing I remember most vividly, and I don't even know if it's right or not, but I think it's vivid, it was we were playing Wausau for the championship at the last game of the year, and we got right down to the 1-yard line, and Schilke took the ball and couldn't get over. And so the next play, they gave it to Ray Egger at 125 pounds, and he went right through the line and made the touchdown, won the game. But because he was by far, in most people's opinion, much tougher than Schilke was. Yeah.
That Wausau game, that was a big game, 6-0 win for Marshfield. Six to nothing was the final score, and that was a big game. And that had to be a real thrill because we talked to the 27 guys also about they had to beat Wausau the last game of the year to win their championship in 27. And of course, beating Wausau was always such a big struggle. That had to be a great thrill for any team to beat Wausau, wasn't it?
Oh, sure, because Wausau was a much bigger school than Marshfield was. And, fortunately, they didn't have as good a coach as they did when Brockmeyer came along later. So under Cabby Ewers, they won some and they lost some. But they were always the toughest team to beat. Stevens Point was awfully tough in those years too. Yeah. Antigo had a few good years too. Yeah.
Dr. Lewis, you mentioned that the passing back in that era wasn't much, and I don't know that anybody passed the ball real well. In fact, by my stats, the guy who passed the ball the most for Marshfield in 1930 was Carl Schilke, and he was only 2 of 14, so guys didn't just pass the ball very much. But what was the passing game like back then?
I think it was so little that I don't even remember much about it. Yeah, I don't think we had many passing plays, and we didn't do it very often. Yeah.
Wasn't the ball a bit different back then, a bit rounder perhaps, and more difficult to throw?
It was. It was a bigger ball, much more round than it is today. Yeah, no question about that. Yeah.
Well, you showed up to play football in the 1931 team, which was 1-6, yes. 1-6 that year, and I guess that was your first experience for varsity football. And tell us about your introduction to varsity football.
Well, it was a little bit different than playing in Purdy School, where we won them all and had no trouble. It was tough going in those years because we didn't really have. Herb Scheibe, who was the captain of the team in 31, was our tackle. He was a very good football player, but outside of that, most of the people were just sort of developing folks. I don't remember too much about.
You were a center back in that.
Yeah.
How much varsity experience did you get that first year?
I played every minute of every game up until the last game. I was hurt in practice, and so against Wausau I didn't play the first quarter, and then they put me in mostly for the defense because I was a bigger person. I weighed about 170 pounds in those days, and Wausau had a big running back named Callahan who went and played end at Madison, and my job was to try to take off some of the interference. We had some good linebackers, but and we did slow them down a little bit, but they beat us pretty badly, as I remember, 28-0 or something like that.
32-6.
How much?
32-6.
32-6, yeah. We played in the mud. It was a terrible day. We played at Wausau, and I remember the fields were awful in those days because most of them didn't have much grass on them. We played a lot of dirt and sand and mud and that sort of thing, yeah. We didn't have the nice turf they have today, yeah.
Anything you remember about that 1931 squad, Dr. Lewis, and some of the players on that team?
Well, I remember some of the players because some of them played again in the next year, like Red Schultz and Reagers and Dix. And, Floyd Allison played as a sophomore. And Pat Smith played. He was our star in 33. We had a fellow named Weatherford that played in 32. And we had a nice bunch of people, but we just weren't very good, yeah.
You did win one game that year. By my records here, you went to Rhinelander and beat Rhinelander 6-0. Any recollections of that game?
I don't remember at all, no.
That was your one win. Apparently, let me see if I can find who scored the touchdown for you in that game against Rhinelander. No, I really can't. But you beat Rhinelander 6-0 by what I've got here. And that was your only... Oh, wait a minute. Ray Eggers scored a touchdown to beat Rhinelander 6-0. So...
I can remember the field up at Rhinelander. That was about all I can remember up there, yeah.
You mentioned the playing fields weren't nearly what we have today. What were some of the fields around the conference like that back then?
Well, as I recall, Rhinelander had a steep side on one side, so it was built on the bottom of a hill sort of thing. So they had some bleachers on that side. I don't remember too much about the Rapids and Stevens Point. Wausau was right outside of their high school, if I recall correctly. It was just like old McKinley most, and it was just dirt and mud and some grass, but not very much at all. Nakusa, I can remember, they had a fairly nice field down there, and I don't know much about it, but I remember playing down there as a junior when we were in 32. Most of them didn't have many. They just had bleachers or nothing at all like we did, yeah. Yeah, no.
It certainly was much different. What about travel? How did you guys get to these road games?
Well, the civic-minded individuals in town would drive their cars, and we'd always find the coach would always figure out how many people he needed, and they would take the cars. And I honestly don't know how they got all the equipment there. I suppose somebody must have had a truck or something, but we never paid any attention to that. And they'd usually take 4 or 5 fellows in a car, and the local businessmen would drive you there, and you'd show up at the school before, and they'd put you in the car. And sometimes, like when we went to Rhinelander, I can remember that we used to stop at a place I think it was called the Mint in Wausau, and have lunch. And I remember it well because Murphy always ordered the food, and we always had soft-boiled eggs, and I never could stand eggs, so I didn't have much to eat at noon. And then, of course, we came back. The games in those days were played on Saturday afternoons, almost all of them. No night games at all. And so we got lunch usually when we went someplace. And we'd go to a restaurant. They'd have made all arrangements, and they not only made the arrangements, they picked out the food for you, whatever the coach thought was nutritious and not harmful and so forth, yeah.
One of the gentlemen I talked to about the 1927 team remembered. The one thing he remembered about the Mint Cafe was the silver dollars that were emblazoned in the floor. Did you remember that?
I do remember that. Yes, I do. Yes.
You always got a big kick out of that. They also mentioned on that 27 team that on occasion they would take trains to games. Did you guys ever do that?
The only time we ever took a train to game was when I was in Purdy School playing basketball, and we went to Owen, and we took a train up and I took a train back to Owen. We played their high school team. We were in Purdy School, yeah. And it was a very interesting experience. So it's the only train we ever took, yeah. No.
Well, let's talk about the 1932 team, which again was a great team for Marshfield. He won the championship with a record of 4 wins, no losses, and 3 ties, which is quite unusual. But any overall thoughts you have about that 1932 ball club?
Well, I think it was a wonderful team, although we were not the best team in the conference. And without any question, Stevens Point was a much better team than we were. Most of their team went right on and played college ball at Stevens Point. But we played them the first game. We played them, as I think, at Rapids because there was no field in Marshfield, and it was a home game. So we couldn't play at Stevens Point because that gave him an advantage. So, and the thing I remember most about that game, they had a star back named Nugent who had been all-conference the year before, and he broke away from us in the second quarter, and Charlie Vaughn, who was one of our guards, was playing safety because of the way our defense worked out, which is another story. But anyway, he caught Nugent and dragged him down on about the 15 or 20-yard line. We held him, and so it ended up 0-0. Nugent got hurt shortly thereafter and he didn't play the second half. I'm sure if he'd have played, we would not have won the game. Mm-hmm. I think they had 4 or 5 people were on the all-conference team that year and so forth. But it was the thing that impresses me is I think more about it. We played as a team. I think we all got along as a team, and you know, you hear so much about the basketball, the Olympics basketball team that doesn't play as a team. There's a lot to that, because when we were seniors in 1933, we all thought we were going to be the champions again, because we had a lot of people back and a lot of good players and a couple of new players that were good players, but we didn't play as a team. We had a couple of people that wanted to be stars, and they just didn't play together like we should have. So, but the 32 team was a good team. We got along very well. Yeah.
That was certainly an unusual circumstance. As I remember, you guys were 4-0-3, and Stevens Point was like 6-0-1. But because of the criteria that they developed before the start of the season, they awarded co-championships that year. But that certainly was unusual, tying 3 ball games. You talked about the defense, your defensive philosophy on that team, Coach Murphy, and what he did defensively. Tell us about what the defensive strategies were back in that era.
Well, of course, you wouldn't have to protect against the pass very much. And I think almost all teams played a 6-man line back in those days on defense. They'd put 3 linebackers and then 2 safeties. And in our particular team, because I was the center, in most teams, the center was the middle linebacker. But I was too slow to be a middle linebacker, and I wasn't tough enough to be a middle linebacker anyway. So they put me in as the guard. Most teams used a single wing, and they had unbalanced line on offense with 2 tackles on one side. And I usually played against the 2 tackles because I was 190 pounds and nobody else weighed more than 167 in our team. And but we had the 3 best linebackers in the conference. We had Ray Eggers was the middle linebacker, and he was an outstanding linebacker. And Pat Smith played the other linebacker, and he was almost as good as Eggers and a little bigger than Eggers. And then Bud Foster, who was our fullback, Smith was one of our halfbacks, and Foster was our fullback. He'd played tackle the year before. He weighed 167 pounds. We had 3 excellent linebackers, and I think that was the secret to our defense. Our role as a defensive line was to get rid of the interference, so that our ends were taught to knock down the interference. The people in the middle of the line were taught to take out 2 people and let the linebackers make the tackle, which they did very, very well. Mm-hmm. And we were a very tough team. I think Nakusa is the only team that scored against us. If I remember correctly.
You're right, 13. They scored 2 touchdowns against you, and you beat them 25-13. Everybody else you shut out that year.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, they're the only team that scored against us that year. Yeah, yeah.
And they usually were not the strongest team in the league, so something must happen there.
No, yeah. And I don't know why they scored. Yeah.
What about offensively? You mentioned the defensive philosophy. Most teams, I guess, use the single wing, but what were some of the general offensive philosophies back then?
Well, it was very simple. You know, I've forgotten the exact numbers, but each hole between the guard, the tackle, between the tackle and the end, and so we had the quarterback called the signal in the huddle, and because we did use huddles in those days, and we ran the ball almost always. I would say that the fullback carried the ball more often in those days than they do today, but most of the time it was the tailback that carried. Once in a while we'd shift to the left side, which would bring what we'd call our right halfback or wing back as a tailback, and he'd carry the ball. Reverses were rare but occasional. We did have in our team, we did use the double wing formation rarely, but on occasion. We rarely passed at all. I don't remember passing, and I think, as I remember it, Ray Egger did the passing, although he was playing what they call the quarterback position. I don't think Dix could throw a pass. Pat Smith was a good passer, but I think Eggers did that, yeah.
From what I have, you threw 24 passes that year. Eggers threw 23 and Smith threw 1.
Yeah.
So you're right, it didn't. Were there any times, what were the occasions when a coach or the offensive captain would decide that a pass was warranted? At what point in a ball game did you decide that maybe a pass might be a good idea to try on this play?
I don't think I can answer that question, because I don't, that was strictly up to, I'm pretty sure that Pat Smith called all the plays for our team. And he was the wingback, not the quarterback. But I think he made that decision, and I have no idea what prompted it at all. I don't think the coach ever talked to him about it. I think it was strictly he had a list of plays, and when he wanted to use it, he used it. Yeah.
Well, that certainly is a difference in football between then and now, in that you had a gentleman on the field responsible for calling the plays. And do you recall what went into that, or how a coach prepared that team captain to make those calls for each game?
I don't recall that at all. I don't know as he ever did. Yeah. I think he just he picked the guy he thought would do the best job of calling and let him make the decisions. Yeah. And we never questioned it. We never questioned whatever the quarterback called or what the guy who was calling the play called. We just did what he told us to do. Yeah.
Well, that 1932 team was a great team, Dr. Lewis, and you talked about that opener, the tie with Stevens Point. Any other highlights you can recall from that 32 team?
Well, I can recall several. I think the next toughest game that we had was against Antigo. I don't know what Antigo stated, but they probably were second in the conference. I don't know. But anyway, they had a big team, and they had a running team. They ran end sweeps a lot. And one of our left end, who was one of our better ball players, Stan Russian, he didn't weigh much, 135, 140 pounds. He played as a sophomore too, but he was hurt, so he couldn't play in that game. And this is what I remember, because Bitzer took Bud Ganster, who was a substitute guard that was probably about 165 pounds, and took him out there and trained him how to play defensive end against Antigo. And his job, as I just was talking about, was to take out at least 2 blockers when they came out. They pulled people and they ran good interference. And then, of course, Ganster took those people out, and our linebackers stopped the ball carrier, and we stopped them cold. And they were a very good team. I can remember that very vividly. And the other recollection that I will never forget, we were playing at Nakusa down there in that game, and I was playing center, and the fellow opposite me on defense was one of those talkers. He was a trash talker. He said something I've forgotten what I said. I looked up and I said to him, "We're going to run this ball right over you this year. This play, and we're going for a touchdown." And I centered the ball back to Dix, and he went right over at center and ran 70 yards or so for a touchdown. And that's something I'll never forget. Yeah.
The only note I have on that team in terms of actual plays was against Wisconsin Rapids. A gentleman named Schultz blocked a punt out of the end zone for a touchdown. I think that's probably maybe an obscure play. I'm not sure you remember that one, but that's one note I have, blocking a punt in the end zone and recovering for a touchdown against Wisconsin Rapids.
I don't remember that at all, no. Red Schultz was an all-conference guard. He was about 135 pounder. He came from out in the Nasonville, Chile area, and he just died about a year ago. I went to his funeral. He was one of those rare people that could slice through the line and catch the guy in the backfield before he got started. And as I mentioned, with the unbalanced line, I usually played over the heavy tackles, and he played just to the other side of the center. So there was he just knew the center in those days, of course, couldn't look up. He was looking back. He was passing the ball back. So he was always a little bit at the mercy of somebody who played opposite him. And Schultz knew how to get by that guy all the time. And he was in their backfield so often, it was just unbelievable. Yeah.
I certainly did a great job on that occasion. Your ball club in 32 had to be a bit different than the 30 championship team in that there was not that big runner like Carl Schilke, right, who was the main cog in the offense. As you mentioned, it was more of a team game, but tell us about some of those guys who did handle those responsibilities that made this team so successful.
Well, I think Ray Egger was a fighter, and he was the captain of the team. He was the best defensive man we had. He was the best punter we had, the best runner we had, the best everything we had. He wasn't very big, but he was just a fighter. He would just never give up. And I think he was the captain of the team. And I think that he made us a team in many respects. He was a great guy. Pat Smith was a very fine player, and next year became a real star. Bud Foster, who was playing fullback, was one of those rah-rah guys. He'd played tackle the year before. He loved football. Bud came from Colby. I think there were 8 or 10 boys in his family, and he wanted to play tougher football than they played up at Colby in those days. So he came to Marshfield, where his uncle Jack Hobelsberger was one of Rodis's right-hand men out the Rodis factory. In the Nakusa game, the game next to last, he was playing offensive tackle on the line. He was playing tackle, it was offensive defense. But he had a terrible injury involving his face and almost tore his eye out in that game. And somebody told him that if he dropped out of school, he was a senior when he came here, he could have another year of eligibility. And he so wanted to play football that he dropped out of school, and he rigged up a tackling dummy in his uncle's house and practiced all year. And he was a rah-rah guy. He was, Egger wasn't, he was a fighter, but he wasn't a rah-rah guy. And Foster, I think, gave us a lot of esprit de corps that made for the teams being a team. We only had one sophomore, Clem Binding. Clem is still living here in town, but he was a year or two older than you would expect as a sophomore, but he was one of our bigger people. He probably weighed 167 or 80 pounds. He and Ellison played tackles. It was Schultz on defense was a great guy. We had a good team, yeah. We all played together, yeah.
They talk so much, Dr. Lewis, about that line play being really a team game where linemen have to play together as a team to be successful. Tell us about those linemen that you played with that made these running backs so successful.
Well, both tackles, Binding and Ellison, were very tough, good blockers. They played good defense, but they also played very good offense. Charlie Vaughn, who played the weak side guard on offense, so he was the pulling guard in those days, and he was fast. He probably weighed 160 pounds, and he was very good at getting out and blocking. I think neither of our ends were very big, but they were all tough guys. They were Jan Rush and Bob Grewell. They were all nice people, and they all played well. Yeah, but so many of them, you see, like Schultz and Vaughn were the only seniors in that line. The rest of us were all juniors and Clem Binding was a sophomore. That's one reason I said I thought next year we were going to be much better than we turned out to be. The whole backfield except Smith graduated. We didn't have many people that substituted. We had a few substitutes, but most often the same 11 started and finished. I played every minute of every game, for example, yeah. No.
You won the championship in 1932. What was the feeling in the community about a great event like this?
Oh, it was wonderful. Everybody was very happy for us. I'm not sure I recall this correctly, but I think I recall it, that the business people got together and bought tickets for us to go down and see the Minnesota football game at Madison and took us down there in their cars. The reasons I remember, and I think this was the right year, I went with the car that took me was John Adler, old John Adler that owned the theaters in town. And I think he had a brand new big Chrysler, and he drove about 90 miles an hour, and I was scared to death. And he was very serious. He said, you know, I learned that if you drive fast, you're not on the road as long. And as long as you're not on the road so long, you're safer from all these other terrible drivers. And he sincerely believed that. But we saw a Minnesota football game. The town people did that for us, yeah.
Well, it had to be a great moment to win that championship. And as you mentioned, you had some high hopes for 1933, but things just didn't turn out. Any thoughts you have on why that 33 team was not as successful as you had hoped it would be?
Well, in retrospect, I'm, as I mentioned before, I think it was because we had people that were prima donnas. I wouldn't call Pat Smith a prima donna, but he had a lot of publicity after the first game. I think the Milwaukee Journal had an article about him. I think, did we play Stevens Point first?
Second.
Second, okay. Maybe it was, I don't know who we played.
Medford.
Medford. It was probably after the second game against Stevens Point, I think, that, did we win that one?
Let me see. You opened against Medford and won 13-7, then beat Stevens Point 2-0, and Smith had 101 yards in the first game and 97 in the second, so that's a pretty good total.
Yeah. Well, somewhere along the line, Milwaukee Journal wrote an article and had his picture in the paper, the smiling halfback. And he was a very good halfback. He was a very good-looking guy, too, and a marvelous normal athlete. He was a wonderful basketball player and did a lot of things, but some of the other people resented that. And there was another back who wanted to be a hero. I'll not mention his name, but he'd not played the year before because he'd been hurt. He'd had a concussion, and the doctors wouldn't let him play. He had a concussion as a sophomore, but they let him play as a senior. And I think there was a lot of friction, and both of them had friends. And I just had the feeling that somehow we didn't work together as a team so much as we were trying to help Smith or we were trying to help Bill. Yeah, yeah.
That was a tough situation. Did you see that in the offensive line, as you were mentioning in the offensive line, where there's some problems there, or were you guys still working as hard as you could to be successful?
If I did, I didn't realize it. I didn't realize it at the time. No, I think we had more confusion in our line that year. We had an abundance of ends, and we had a shortage of guards. And about halfway through the season, I don't know whether it's because I was doing a poor job at center or not, but they made me a guard instead of a center, and put Bob Graywell, who was played the end the year before, brought him in and making him center. And I think it was because we were having trouble with the guards, and they just thought somehow the line just wasn't gelling like they should have gelled. Actually, Floyd Allison didn't play as a senior because he was too old. So we had Binding and the two ends and myself back, and then they made the shift around. I think our line never really came together, yeah.
Well, your team still wasn't that bad, 3-4-1 that season. Are there any things about that 33 team you recall? Any highlights from that season?
No, not really, no. Oh, I remember, I think Bill Weatherford caught a couple passes up in Antigo that we won up there, which was a little bit of a surprise. I wasn't surprised, but then we started losing, and I don't know what happened, yeah.
Well, Dr. Lewis, that was your last year of football at McKinley High School. Do you have any thoughts about what football did for you, what competing athletics did for you in terms of preparing you for some other things later in life?
I'm not really sure. It was a wonderful experience. I got to know people, and that's nice, and I just enjoyed it. And I think I learned a lot about sportsmanship and that sort of thing. I think Murphy was strong on teaching, and Burbitzer was too, on the proper way to live your life and that sort of thing. But it's a little hard to say that you can translate experiences in the football field to life living, and it's easy to talk about it, but I'm not sure how true it is. Yeah.
After this 32 team, Marshfield's fortunes kind of went down in football. Jack Murphy gave up the coaching a few years later, and they had a succession of coaches really for the next 12 or 15 years until, and Kai Daniels, I guess in the late 40s. Anything in particular that you can put your finger on as to why the fortunes fell in terms of Marshfield football in the next decade or so?
No, I really can't, because, of course, I was gone. I went to college right away, but I came back quite a bit the first few years, and they just weren't very good years, but I really can't. And then, of course, the war came along, and I did come back in 46, and I got interested in the teams. And, of course, they had Jerry Witt and Weiler and Johnny Kleinheinz and people like that playing, so they were picking up a little bit in those days, but that decade in there, I don't know, yeah.
Well, Dr. Lewis, anything else you'd like to talk about your experiences playing football at McKinley?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
It was a long time ago, and I'm sure, do you still see a few of those guys who you played with back in those days?
No, I really don't, because there aren't any of them around. The only one that's left in town is Ray Egger, who's having trouble getting around, can't drive and this sort of thing. And I've never run into Clem Vining. I just don't see Clem. Elder Seamers was a substitute on the team. I see his daughter now and then. She used to work with me, but I don't. They're the only ones that are still left alive in Marshfield. And I don't know about. I think if you look at the people on the team, almost all of them are dead except me.
Longtime Marshfield resident Dr. Russell Lewis, who was selected for the Marshfield Tiger Athletic Hall of Fame in 2011. This is Gene DeLisio for WDLB and WOSQ Sports.